welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C., and we've had a week of rapid flux and ferment in the international sphere. We've also had a week in which the Randy Credico tax Wall Street Democratic campaign has scored an important success. We'll get the full vote totals later on in the show, but Randy Credico, running on a shoestring, has been able to surpass at least two candidates on the list, even though Credico was blacked out, boycotted, censored by the dominant Wall Street hyena power. Credico has surpassed Sal Albanese, and Sal Albanese had benefited from being in the New York One cable television and other candidates debates, where he was always included in the TV debates with such luminaries as Weiner, Quinn, and the infamous de Blasio. So we're going to be exposing de Blasio as a Soros clone, a Soros puppet. You want to go from the Wall Street protagonist, Bloomberg, to the left synthetic puppet of Soros? Well, if you want Soros in command and ultra-left destruction of civilization, ultra-left financiers, then de Blasio or de Blasio is your candidate. And we have reports of voting irregularities, vote fraud. Notice I say vote fraud, not voter fraud. It's not voter fraud done by little individuals. No. It's vote fraud done from the top down, and we normally say Karl Rove. But in this case, it looks like the corrupt New York City Democratic machine, the infamous Tammany Hall, that in a number of places in the Bronx, where Credico was especially strong, made sure that his name did not appear on the voting machines, on these old mechanical voting machines, right, where you pull the lever. You actually sort of kick the lever down, or you can vote the straight party line with a lever. Anyway, we'll get a report on that. We also want to direct everybody's attention now to the need to stand up for the U.S.-Russian relationship, which we have been doing here and which we intend to do more and more. As we've seen in this past week, President Putin of Russia, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and other people from the Russian Foreign Ministry, certainly, and other Russians in general, have done an important service to the world. Not only was this a masterful stroke of diplomacy, carried out, ironically enough, on the birthday of Cardinal Richelieu of France, the great diplomat, the guy, the founder of modern diplomacy, really, in France back in the 1630s, 1640s, and so forth. Richelieu, his birthday was the 9th of September, and it was that Monday, the 9th of September, that marked what we're going to look back on as a diplomatic revolution. And very, very interesting to see Lavrov following in the footsteps of Cardinal Richelieu and of course, Putin. But the outcome of this now is that Russia has the avocation of saving the United States from itself. The Russian fleet coming to New York Harbor and San Francisco Harbor in September, October 1863, 150 years ago, in some very dark times of the American Civil War, after the draft riots, when the Confederate sympathizers ran wild in New York, lynching black people and killing black people in the streets. And when, of course, we also had the serious defeat of the Union at the Battle of Chickamauga on the 19th, 20th of September, a day that was saved, by the way, ironically, by General Turchin, a Don Cossack who commanded a division there, and he had experience in the Crimean War of the 1850s. He'd fought the British and the French in the Crimean War, and he brought that experience to the Army of the Cumberland, and was able to help save the day for the incompetent Rosecrans. It's a combination of George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and the Sledgehammer of Nashville. But Thomas and Turchin were the 1-2 punch for the Union at Chickamauga. In those dark times, the arrival of the Russian fleet meant everything. So we are now announcing that there will be a suitable commemoration with full historical details and in the spirit of Russian-U.S. cooperation, the combination that defeated fascism in World War II. That will be held at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of the McClendon Group, founded by Sarah McClendon, the Dean of the White House Press Corps for quite a number of years under George Bush. She had served the longest. The courtesy of the McClendon Group has opened the possibility of having this commemoration at the National Press Club. The date, Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. The regulars of the McClendon Group may want to show up a little bit earlier, but you'll see that on the invitation. But for the vast public that will come, it'll be Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. That is the exact 150th anniversary of the arrival of the Russian fleet in New York Harbor, an event which sent consternation to London, Paris, and Madrid, because all three were getting set to intervene on the side of the Confederacy and the slave power. And it also encouraged, therefore, the Union in the successful defense of national unity. And as Gideon Wells said on that occasion, God bless the Russians. Well, that's the National Press Club, Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. And you'll be coming out not just to get educated in the details of foreign policy and that period, which have been suppressed by the corrupt quackademic establishment, who have every interest in hiding these facts in line to try to make the State Department look good. But you'll also be contributing something to an expression of solidarity between the United States and Russia. You'll be paying a debt of honor, which is owed no matter what happens in the meantime, as Gideon Wells said. God bless the Russians. So I hope to see everybody that's in the D.C. area or who can make it any other way, Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m., the McClendon Group at the National Press Club, and that will be a highly interesting evening. And we will talk a little bit more about the program next time. Program's still a little bit in flux, but it will be a full program, and you'll be glad you came. So that's that. Now, there's also a 9/11 conference. Let me just mention that. By the time you hear this, I will have already delivered my contribution, such as it is. That will be on the morning of Saturday, the 14th of September at the Sheraton Crystal City in Crystal City, Virginia, not so far from National Airport. Okay, so we'll be back in a minute with the news, but remember, the Russian fleet and the U.S.-Russian relationship very much in the center of attention. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, the background for everything we say today is the jihadis, the takfiris, the killers, the bearded destroyers of civilization are attacking Malula, one of the oldest Christian places in the world. And in case there was any doubt about the public relations skills of these butchers, they're attacking Malula, one of the few places in the world where the Aramaic language is preserved, the language spoken by Christ and the disciples. and got some of the oldest churches in the world. The place has been under heavy attack by the Nusra Brigade, by the Al-Qaeda butchers, the same people who certainly killed lots and lots of U.S. servicemen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mad Dog Kerry, who deserves a vacation in beautiful Nuremberg, is determined to help these Al-Qaeda butchers. He wants to send weapons. Indeed, the news this week is that the first weapons sent by the United States to these killer terrorist rebels have arrived. I think it's time for Kerry, Rice, Brennan, Clapper to be fired. I think it's time for them to be scrutinized for the possibility of indictments in providing material support to terrorism. This is the colossal irony. 12 years after 9/11, the big issue is, will the United States intervene to put Al-Qaeda in command of yet another country? Because Libya, of course, that chaotic breakdown that is called Libya, is already under Al-Qaeda control. So if you fought and died to prevent an Al-Qaeda sanctuary in Afghanistan, surprise, Mad Dog Kerry, Skull and Bones, and the State Department have a surprise for you. So that is the background. And naturally, Obama, by last Sunday to Monday, was looking at defeat in both houses, not just in the House of Representatives, where his defeat was a foregone conclusion, but also in the Senate. And I was able to sample this with a local congressman here, Delaney, who at least came out of this discussion leaning against it. And there have been lots and lots of demonstrations. The Syrian Americans were in town on Monday. And then we got to Monday morning. The blasé, blue blood bonesman, Kerry, saying something which I think he intended as a throwaway line. You have to remember, Kerry's mind is like a grab bag. It's like a rag bag. It's a potpourri of fragments of thoughts and demagogic slogans. So he was asked, well, how could you stop the attack? Well, of course, give up all your chemical weapons. But that won't happen. Ha, ha, ha. Well, thank goodness Putin and Lavrov were following this closely. They called his bluff. They called the Skull and Bones bluff. And, of course, then everybody in the world began to take notice, and everybody began to say, oh, this would be a wonderful way out. No, not everybody, but the people of goodwill were then interested in coming in. Naturally, the deal has now taken off, and we're hoping that this is contributing to closing the door to violence and war. Turkey is not happy. Erdogan has now been bamboozled to a queen's taste. Poor Erdogan. Obama whispered to him on the telephone at night that he wanted to make him great. He wanted to make him the new sultan of a new Ottoman Empire, and Davutoglu would be the Grand Vizier, and it didn't pan out, did it? So Turkey has gone out on the limb for Obama, and Obama has left them high and dry. The Bahrainis, those wonderful champions of democracy at home, and the Saudis are not happy. They wanted the United States at war. They wanted your sons and daughters dying for their degenerate monarchies, where, of course, there's no such thing as any human rights, right? And look at the status of women is a monstrosity. Hey, Hillary, let's do a little number on women's rights in Saudi Arabia, shall we? No, she can't, because she's gotten a bribe of $500,000 worth of white gold jewelry. We'll be watching her. And I think, dear friends, with this, we have got the first nail in the box, let's say, for Hillary's presidential candidacy. She is, of course, a warmonger. Because of her personal weakness, she's always got to be the biggest warmonger, the most bellicose player in the room. This is a disaster. She's too weak, because that's the exact definition of weakness, when you have to overcompensate. And there are others. Obviously, the Syrian opposition, General Idris, the CIA golden boy, also sharing the fate of Nguyen Cao Ki and so many others over the years. We saw the five of them. It looked like, the Red Brigade Central Committee there for a while. But there they were, and they are not happy. So now what do we have? thanks to Putin and Lavrov, we've got a process of negotiation. What we're reminded of is that the Russian policy is one of war avoidance. It is a peace policy. Say what you will. Last week, I devoted some time to Wharton Barker in 1878 to the early 1900s, talking about what Tsar Alexander II had told him about Russian peace policy. And we're seeing it before our eyes. Now, Putin has continued to warn the United States, Obama, must drop this insane threat of force. This actually violates treaties, right? There's something in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that nuclear states are not allowed to threaten invasion of non-nuclear states when the non-nuclear states are so because of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But no, the U.S., of course, the bully, Mr. Bluster. This is the Hitlerian playbook. And I want to remind Kerry, we're going to talk Hitler at will here, because Kerry has talked Hitler, Nuremberg, Munich moment, Day of Infamy, Never Again, the entire panoply of World War II anti-Nazi fascist rhetoric has been deployed here by Kerry. We intend to turn it back against him because he is the one who fills the bill, and certainly not Assad, Putin, or anybody on that side. Not the Iranians, not Hezbollah. They're not in that business of threatening to roll over small countries. So Putin wants the U.S. to drop the threat, and obviously, as he points out, no country can be expected to disarm under imminent threat of attack. The Syrian chemical weapons have always been thought to be an attempt to counterbalance, to some limited extent, the exorbitant military power of the Israelis, which takes the form not only of a huge chemical inventory on the Israeli side, but, of course, also several hundred nuclear weapons, including missile-firing submarines, two of them that we know of, that can be used for retaliation purposes. So stop with the threat. Stop arming the rebels, as we've said. Stop arming those killers who were attacking the Christians of Malula. The rebels saying, we sent you St. Paul and Christianity. You send these killers to us. No fair. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Remember the commemoration, the 150th, the sesquicentennial of the arrival of the Russian fleet in New York City, September 24th, 1863, the great foreign policy event of the Civil War. It's up there with Gettysburg and Vicksburg and any other huge turning point because, as Cassius Clay said, this was the decision. To keep the British and the French out meant that secessionism would not succeed, the Union would be restored, and slavery would be wiped out. And that's going to be at the National Press Club, the McClendon Group, on Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. And I urge you to come, stand up for the U.S.-Russian relationship. You can argue, perhaps, that the world is now returning to its natural state, which is a U.S.-Russian condominium. That is what Roosevelt had in mind when he was poisoned by the Churchill gang in 1945. A U.S.-Russian condominium that allows the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Latin Americans to be prosperous and make money, and reduces the British to irrelevance. And the British have not talked too much because, of course, they have egg on their face. They voted against the war. Good for them. That was their finest hour, even though there might have been some ulterior motives. But even so, another guy who's not happy is Fabius. Oh, Fabius, the meddler. He's trying to find ways to reintroduce the force, right? He was the first one to come back to the UN with a UN Security Council resolution saying, if you're going to pledge to get rid of your chemical weapons, then there's got to be Chapter 7, War Against Syria, in the resolution. And as Lavrov shot back within an hour or two, this is unacceptable. There will be no approval of war measures against Syria in any way, shape, or form in any UN Security Council resolution. So the U.S. has to back off on that. There's also the interesting question, which we've broached, I guess, indirectly. The Israelis, Monsieur, the Israelis, they've got nuclear weapons. They've got chemical weapons. If the Syrians are going to give up their chemical weapons, then the heat should be on the Israelis. Give up at least your chemical weapons, something in that direction. And, of course, no, the Anglo-Americans say, no, the Israelis have got to be above international law. Well, that is not going to fly in the world that we're in. Very interesting is the commentary of Zbigniew Brzezinski, right, who's been around. I compared him to Kissinger. Kissinger is useless. Kissinger says, I was against military intervention until we got to this point, but now that we've reached this point, I have to support the strikes against Syria. Zbigniew, I think, rather better, at least after the fact. He says, the era of automatic U.S. domination of the Middle East is ending. It's ending. Yeah, it's ending. 5 years ago, you could have said, tax Wall Street, seize the Fed, 30 million new productive jobs, launch a campaign of high technology, high capital good content exports into the developing world. Then you'd have some power. But right now you have no power because you have no economic power. So that's the way it is, right? If you let Wall Street run the show, then we get into these terrible dilemmas. So Zbigniew says that we could have a grand settlement, and the grand settlement could include things like solving the Israeli-Palestinian question. And there is the hope that this is going in that direction. And let me just, even an individual like Krauthammer here in the Washington Post gives us a certain insight. The total domination of the United States in the Middle East began, I would say, by some measures, in 1972, when Egypt kicked out the Soviet advisors, the Soviet development teams, and turned to the United States. This was done under Sadat, who did it partly because he'd been brainwashed by British philosophical radicalism, people like, John Stuart Mill, stuff like this. This is what he thought was great, right, on liberty. Sadat loved that stuff. So it was in 1972 when Egypt switched from being a Russian client to being a U.S. client that the Soviet-Russian position began to erode in the Middle East. Now what we see is that the U.S. position has partially collapsed. And once again, behind everything we hear, right, we're told, Obama says, we've got to bomb Syria now so that we can have the chance to bomb Iran later. The American people want none of it. Sick of war, disgusted by war, finding that nothing is more revolting than war, as General MacArthur said in his farewell address to the Congress. But now we've got this situation where the American people don't want war. The elites seem to think that it's time for war, and this has everything to do with Egypt. As I've said before, one of the possible causes for Obama opening the doors to war after the 21st of August is not what he says. It could be threats from Saudi Arabia to dump the dollar, threats from the Israelis taking God knows what form. Maybe there are new blackmail dossiers against Obama, his nighttime activities, God knows what. But the big one is Egypt, that Kerry, Rice, and Patterson and the rest of them noted with horror that U.S. influence in Egypt was zero. And that is, I think, what they were concerned with trying to restore. And now that, I think, explains the urge to go to war more than this Iranian side, at least in the immediate sense. But, of course, the media don't want to talk about the collapse of U.S. influence in Egypt, although it's obvious enough with General Sisi. So, once again, the shift of Egypt in 1972 from Soviet partner to U.S. partner, and now in 2013 going from U.S. partner to some undefined status, but certainly no longer the obedient puppet state of the U.S. That, I think, is what is dogging the State Department crowd. All right. Assad also says, I think and this is highly interesting. Assad says the U.S. must back off. We got to stop with these attack threats, stop arming the rebels. And Moallem, the foreign minister, adds that the Israelis have got to give up their chemical weapons. Now, Krauthammer argues that Assad is a monster. This is ridiculous. You look at that Charlie Rose interview on PBS this week. Charlie Rose, if you want, is a monster. If you want to see an old Rouet, an old Dorian Gray, ravaged by alcohol and worshiping power and stubbornly repeating this narrow, provincialoid, hysterical, irrational, subjectivist Washington line, well, there you go. Assad, quiet dignity, calm dignity, courage, steely determination. As I'll try to say at the end, we are now in an era where, after an eclipse and crisis of the human personality, we are beginning to see world historical individuals tread the stage of this planet of ours. Now, the other big stuff. Putin is talking false flag. This is absolutely critical. Putin's op-ed in the New York Times says, in effect, the Goutha events were a false flag, and the coming attack on Israel is a false flag. He's talking false flags. 12 years after 9/11, those of us who have been campaigning on this false flag question, this is now coming to fruition in the sense that we have a major world power, a UN Security Council superpower, saying that the rebels are the ones who did Goutha, false flag, and they're getting ready to strike Israel with another false flag. So false flags are now on the world agenda. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley, Washington, D.C. Now, we want to get the positive side in here. Big progress, world historical progress made this past week in New York City with the surprisingly good result for Randy Credico, running a campaign on a shoestring, no big bucks from Soros, no big bucks from Bloomberg, no big Wall Street angels, but just the power of program and a lot of dedication and a long appeal to the oppressed minorities, especially under the stop and frisk dictatorship of Wall Street in New York City. So let's go to Daniela Walls, who now joins the leading political campaign managers and consultants of our time by having pulled off this. She's up there with Karl Rove and James Carville.
Not Karl Rove. Not
Take it away, Daniela.
Okay. Well, we're stunned by the numbers that came in on election night and thrilled. As you just said, or I don't know if you said it, but as you know, Randy received over 13,000 votes. Considering that Randy ran a truly bare-bones campaign and with very little in the way of organization, it's pretty spectacular. The New York establishment is now scrambling, trying to explain it. It was all because we have a strong program. I think the best way to illustrate what happened on election night is to compare Randy's candidacy to Sal Albanese, the former city councilman who spent well over $300,000, and Randy beat him by more than 2-to-1 margin. Albanese was included in the televised debate and all the major New York papers. He received coverage that Randy did not receive. Randy was pretty much blacked out by all the mainstream New York media. None of the newspapers ever really mentioned him. The New York Times deliberately kept him out, absolutely refused to even mention him on the ballot. Even on election night, Webster, the major media sources, including the Huffington Post and the New York Times, that people relied on to watch the numbers coming in, refused to even list Randy in the election results. They skipped right over Randy altogether on election night and went right from Salgato's numbers to Albanese, and Albanese received less than half the votes that Randy received. On Tuesday, Webster... Hello?
Outrageous. Yeah. Go ahead.
Outrageous. On Tuesday, Webster, I was also getting a lot of messages to the website, especially from people in the Bronx, that reported that Randy's name wasn't on their voting machines. He wasn't even listed on the voting machines in some of the precincts, especially the Bronx. People went out to vote for him, and his name wasn't listed on the ballot in these machines. This is top-down vote fraud. Randy campaigned a lot in the Bronx because no other candidate was, and we got 1,000 votes from 2 precincts in the Bronx that the corrupt Democratic machine is withholding until they investigate why they think we got so many in this area. So we are waiting to see if they give us these 1,000 votes back. Of course, de Blasio would never be subjected, to such similar scrutiny. The Democratic machine is in a tizzy at the moment trying to figure out why we got so many votes on election night after they made it their job to exclude us in every possible way. But still, we're thrilled with the numbers on election night because it's all message-based. People that voted for Randy were voting for the issues. The Wall Street sales tax resonated. It resonated. I think a lot of these votes came from when Randy was on the cover of the New York Metro commuter magazine, which is widely circulated in the subways with the headline Tax Wall Street on their cover. The bottom line is that Randy appealed to people who bothered to investigate who he was and what his platform was. The people who took the time to research the candidates and the issues. I mean, imagine if Randy had appeared in the New York Daily News or the New York Post or the Times or any publication, and they actually mentioned his program. Who knows what his vote count would have been? He probably would have been right up there with these main money guys. They did a New York Times piece a month ago covering every mayoral candidate, and of course the only one they left out was Randy. If they had even mentioned him in a paragraph in that one piece, Randy's votes could have been 25,000. The people who voted on Tuesday had to go looking for him. Other than the New York Metro article, Randy was completely concealed by the press. So the votes we got, which were individuals in New York who went looking. It is really people who did the research on their own, and what appealed to them were the issues. There was nothing about his background or personality that drove them into our camp. They liked his position on the issues. We were program-based. That's what his vote was. I still urge people to go and read his Hello?
Yes, keep going.
Oh,
keep
sorry.
Going.
The phone was ringing on the other. I thought it was you, that I lost you.
No, we're here. Keep going.
I still urge people to go and read his program at Credico2013.org. And I hate to bring this up, Webster, but we're completely out of money at this point, and we need people to really help us by donating again. If we had these numbers on Tuesday with very little money and most of our funds spent petitioning to get on the ballot and not even on campaigning, if we have some funds now, we can really blow this up in the general election. We are taking these 14,000 loyal voters and that momentum with us into the November 5th general election on the Tax Wall Street Party independent ticket. And we'll be right up against de Blasio and the Republican Joe LaHoda. So we will be exposing these guys on everything. And for the first time in a long time in American politics, bringing a strong program. So we're going to need some money to campaign and get the program out there. So if you can donate, you can go to Credico2013.org, Credico2013.org, and there's a big donate button on the homepage of his website. You can also donate to the Tax Wall Street Party at taxwallstreetparty.org. And if you want to start a Tax Wall Street Party in your state or local area or office yourself on the ticket, please give me a call, and we can talk about this at 310-926-1584 or email me at taxwallstreetparty@gmail.com. So today is a 10th day because they're doing a citywide recount, Webster. So by the end of today, we're going to find out if there's going to be a runoff between Thompson and de Blasio, where de Blasio is going to have to go through 3 more weeks of defending his record. Thompson is the only guy besides Randy worth having in a runoff against de Blasio because he did begin to take the gloves off in the primary. Toward the end, in the primary, it was Thompson who coined the phrase "Bill de Blier." There are still 80,000 votes left to be counted, and a lot of these are absentee votes, which is interesting because they were cast in July before de Blasio had his big fabricated burst in the polls. So there is still a lot of hope in the Thompson camp right now. But if de Blasio is certified today, then this will be a very interesting 2 months for a campaign like ours because we have a solid program, and de Blasio's program under scrutiny is, just synthetic. Randy plans to take him to the mat on every one of his phony promises and also call him out for being pro-war. And besides the inconsistencies in de Blasio's economic policy, he is also, like you say, Webster, a pro-war Democrat. While 90% of the public is against war. It won't be long, I think, before its progressive mask begins to completely fall off. But only if there's a candidate like Randy running, which he is and will be until November 5th, because if there's only a candidate like the Republican LaHoda, then de Blasio could run comfortably at the center. Nobody's going to question him. But now we will have a genuine progressive like Randy running on the Tax Wall Street Party for the next 2 months, holding his feet to the fire. The New York Post had an article yesterday titled "De Blasio Veers from the Liberal Left with Tough Crime Talk." On primary night, he already suddenly started sounding like a law and order candidate. The article said, this is a quote, he already tonally and rhetorically walked it back. This is, the night of the primary election already. So he already tonally and rhetorically walked it back from the left when he focused on safety and 9/11 primary night. De Blasio said, it's the job of those of us in positions of authority to keep our city safe and be constantly vigilant to use every tool at our disposal to protect our people. That means more police state. Every tool.
Absolutely. Daniela,
right?
let me propose this.
Mm-hmm.
We are trying to reach a guest in Syria, but because of the war zone, we're not sure we can get through. So let me propose that we'll continue with this segment. Why don't you stay around through the break, right, through the news break? Because I know you got a lot of dirt on De Blasio, and people want to know who is this clown. Okay, so we're going to be back in a couple of minutes. Stay with us. We want to give the dirt on De Blasio. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now we're continuing to give you a rundown here on the very interesting results of the New York City election. So we've heard about the signal success of Randy Credico, right? A success out of all proportion to the financial means, and it shows the traction of these mass traction economic demands, kitchen table demands, make Wall Street pay for the elementary preconditions of human life. Daniela, before we go on, I want to hear about De Blasio, but I think there was this blog called Politicus, which paid, I think, a very sincere tribute to the Credico program.
It was a beautiful tribute.
You want to read some of that for us?
Oh, I'd have to go find it online. Do you have it in front of you by any chance?
No, just to give us a summary then.
Oh, well, it was a blogger who stumbled upon Randy's program only a day before the primary election. And he made it his point to, write about all of Randy's program points. And, I can't summarize the article, but, I could summarize our program points, which would be he wanted to make a point to show them off. Everything is our 0.5 with our 0.5% Wall Street sales tax. We could guarantee a job for every New Yorker with an FDR-style jobs program to completely overhaul the city's aging infrastructure, living wages, increase the minimum wage, real affordable housing development, paid for with the Wall Street sales tax, unlike de Blasio's, which is paid for by the public city pension. We would free college education for city residents as it used to be. SUNY used to be free, as you say, even during the Great Depression, so why can't it be free now? Free transportation for residents on buses, subways, and the ferries. Free medical care for everyone. Medicare for all, or otherwise known as single payer. A moratorium on foreclosures. Stop the closure of New York City hospitals, fire stations, libraries, schools. Even build more, and that's a really big problem in the city right now because a lot of these big developers are grabbing these public landmarks and turning them into condos and private development. There's a big fight with the libraries right now. And also a lot of futuristic experimental development would be possible as well, Webster, on top of saving and improving New York's existing social safety net. We could do a lot of new future things. So
expand it, absolutely. Expand all of that, right? With the shocking statistics this week were that half of the people in New York City are below 150% of the poverty line, which means, given New York City prices, that's abject poverty. Half the places in abject poverty, half the places are almost dependent on food stamps, right? And we want food stamps fully funded. but that's not our program for the future, right? It's new productive jobs at union pay scales, and that's what Credico is offering. So that's political.
New York City is the steepest wealth divide in the Western world, and it's a perfect microcosm of what their plan is to, for the rest of America with their, destroy the middle class austerity program. But if you're voting for de Blasio because you want a progressive reform, then de Blasio is not your man. Randy is. This mayor's race is proving to the Democratic Party that if they don't get back to the roots of being a populist Democrat, they're going to lose. I think our platform was a big influence in at least them changing their act. Who knows if they'll actually deliver, but,
And as you say, Daniela, the Democrats still could lose, right? De Blasio is not the mayor of New York. In other words, the Democratic primary is no longer tantamount to election. You've got this Loda character, and there hasn't been a Democratic mayor in 20 years. But now let's get on to de Blasio. People want to know, who is this guy? Warren Wilhelm was his real name, right? Warren Wilhelm, he changed his name, obviously because the German vote, right? Yorkville is not what it was, so he wanted to go for the Italian vote.
There's less Germans than Italians in New York City.
Well, so let's hear about it now. Here's
a carefully crafted image that's been in the works for some time. I was telling you before about his advocating for expansion of the police state already. When he says use every tool at our disposal to police, which contradicts his Johnny-come-lately and stop and frisk advocacy, he talks about using every tool at his disposal for the police in New York City. Like, what's that? How about doing something about poverty as the first step in policing de Blasio?
Right.
And then the New York Post had another article titled "Webster Clinton's." You're going to love this. Clinton's ready to help de Blasio in mayoral race. I told you in the last episode how the Clintons had been acutely tied to his campaign from the beginning, and how de Blasio was Hillary's campaign manager in 2000, et cetera. Well, the Clintons have finally come out now and are publicly supporting de Blasio. The article says, quote, "The Clintons are known to take care of their own," so stating that he is one of them. The article also states that Patrick Gaspard is de Blasio's closest confidant. So I look up this Patrick Gaspard. Gaspard is the new ambassador to South Africa and is President Obama's former political director. The article says, raising the possibility that Obama is going to swoop in for a campaign appearance. Oh, joy. So this de Blasio candidacy is the ultimate globalist, imperialist, warmonger, Wall Street stew I've ever seen, Webster. Randy likes to say, people are so hungry for a progressive, they invented one, Bill de Blasio. De Blasio is just another George Soros clone, the same group of banksters that brought us Obama. Gaspard was the executive director of the DNC, and the DNC supports Obama's pro-war position. Gaspard was the national field director for America Coming Together Act, which is George Soros' political action committee. So de Blasio couldn't be more hand-in-hand with Soros and his elitist, globalist, and global oligarch plan for austerity for the middle class. This is not the middle-class savior. This is the opposite.
It's the opposite.
And this Gaspard is de Blasio's closest confidant. Back in 2009, listen to this. Back in 2009, when de Blasio was running for public advocate, this small office, Gaspard was making phone calls for him and campaigning for him. So Gaspard goes back to de Blasio from right about after Obama became, right around when Obama became president. Gaspard was working for both guys. He's going from the White House to campaign for a public advocate. So his official day job was political director for the White House. On the side, he's helping de Blasio campaign for public advocate. So the grooming of de Blasio goes way back, I'm finding. De Blasio is so deep in the pack of these warmonger Wall Street hyenas. He looks like
he's looking more and more like a Manchurian candidate, right? They change his name from Warren Wilhelm to Bill de Blasio, and then they equip him with this handler, right? This Gaspard that you're talking about.
Yeah,
now, how about
Gaspard, right?
The one thing that was touted by all the left liberal airheads on MSNBC is the plan to build the low income housing. Now you talked about that before. Take that apart for us.
Okay, well, I told you that he wants to build this affordable housing with $1 billion from the public pension fund.
Right.
We talked about that last episode, where Randy wants to pay for his larger affordable housing plan by taxing Wall Street. I told you about how he is protecting and taking money from the city's worst slumlords, and including some of them, and some of these guys are included, I'm finding, in his future development plan. Some of the guys that contributed the most to his campaign, he had private meetings with them when he said he was all about transparency, and he was going to include the lobbyists that he met with. A friend of mine called their office and said, why didn't you include some of them? And they said, our policy is only to include the people that asked to meet with a public advocate de Blasio, not the other way around. If he solicited meeting with them, we don't include that. But what I want to know is, who he met with. That's more interesting to me. Anyway, so
this sounds like Dick Cheney's meetings with the oil companies. Right? We're back to the same secret government.
Yeah, we'll give you some of the information. We'll disclose some of the list that makes us look good. But we won't tell you that we're meeting with these slumlords who are in our future affordable development plans. Anyway, de Blasio is not a progressive. He's nothing more than the worst type of real estate developer.
Daniela, we're still waiting for Syria, so hang on for 1 minute. We'll do a few more minutes in the next segment, and then we'll let you go. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're just wrapping up our analysis of the New York City voting results. One thing we know for sure is that Randy Credico will be fighting all the way to November 5th. It's the Tax Wall Street Party, and the number one proposal is a 0.5% tax by the city of New York. This is before we get to New York State, before we get to the feds. The city wants reparations from Wall Street from having ruined that wonderful city that it was decades ago. They're going to pay, and they're going to pay to rebuild the city and rebuild the lives of the people that they've crushed under derivatives and this income disparity. When a weasel like de Blasio says affordable, what does that mean? Affordable by whom? Affordable by Bloomberg? The word would be low
not affordable
income.
For people making the $7 an hour minimum wage.
We want to hear about low income, low cost housing. Low cost would be at least the beginning of the truth, but this guy's a complete fraud.
Shouldn't low cost, by definition, be that it's people who are making whatever the minimum wage is can afford to live there if they're working a proper 40-hour work week?
No, not in the world of Soros, right? These are the
in the world of reality, in the world of humanity, isn't that what is the definition of low-income housing?
Let me ask you now about this Lhota, L-H-O-T-A. He is the former chairman of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authorities. In other words, he's responsible for the wonderful state of the subways. Isn't that a success story that we want to include? And you got any good stories about Lhota?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I'll have to tell you next week. I don't. There were 650,000 people who voted for the Democrats, and Republicans got 50,000 votes. So 50, I was so distracted in the midst of this. My nose was so close to the ground amongst these corrupt Democrats that I unfortunately didn't spend much time on Republicans. But now that Lhota has been elected, I'm going to get into it. But I wanted to say, we were talking about de Blasio being, he's not a progressive, but a real estate developer. And I just wanted to explain to you something about this affordable housing with this tiered system.
Go ahead.
You want to hear, Webster? Oh, okay.
Sure thing.
So as I told you last time, he had that 3-year tenure at HUD. We're on his watch. While private, New York City developers fleeced HUD out of hundreds of millions of dollars. He oversaw taxpayer money finding its way into the hands of his private developer friends when he was at HUD. They scurried him out of there after 3 years to go manage Hillary's campaign. But this affordable housing plan, I haven't mentioned yet, is a scam from top to bottom. He calls it a tiered system, meaning his housing plan introduces a few affordable units in otherwise luxury buildings. So here's the deal. By placing a few affordable units in a luxury building, de Blasio has an excuse to subsidize the building and the expenses for his friends with the money from the public pension fund. This is the same exact sort of scams he was running when he was at HUD. Does that make sense? Like, say a building's $20 million to build with 50 units. Then de Blasio puts in 5 units calls it affordable, and then he can get like $10 million of it subsidized. And then he can also grab land that was otherwise zoned for different things. You can say, "Oh, this is for affordable housing. It's such a kind, wonderful thing I'm doing." So
the guy is a weasel. The guy is a Wall Street predator dressed up as an ombudsman. Daniela, I just have to say now, our the interview partner that we have lined up for Syria has now come forward with a number.
Congratulations. That's much more
in the
important.
meantime, though, let's just see. The control room there, I believe by now, has the number. So why don't you just wrap up, and we'll remind people now if they want to be part of this, right? Two more months, almost 2 more months of campaigning.
We have 2 more months. If come help us be part of it. We have 14,000 loyal voters strong now. We are building. There's a lot of momentum here. I'm getting thousands of emails. We appreciate every single person who's writing. If I haven't written back to you, don't be mad at me. It's I'm carrying your email in my heart, and I'm remembering to get back to it. It's just that this is unbelievable, and we are really going to need more volunteers to join the crew for the bureaucratic stuff. I'm going to have to start to put that together because it's starting to fall too hard on me. But if New Yorkers want the real deal in November, a true unbought and unbossed champion of the people, as Shirley Chisholm calls it, ignore Bill de Blasio and vote for Randy Credico on November 5th. He's the only bona fide progressive in this race, also in this country in a long while. And also don't believe his tax the rich plan for people who make over $100,000. This will only raise $30 million. That's 2 subway trains or 30 buses, Webster, compared with Randy's plan to tax Wall Street transactions, which will bring in $60 billion annually.
At least. And again, with the derivatives, it'll be more.
Exactly.
Please just give us those contact features once again quickly.
Credico2013.org. You can donate there, or please read his agenda and his program if you haven't already, or read it, again. And taxwallstreetparty.org has a lot of information. We're going to make a better, more professional, beautiful website this week. We just haven't had the time to do that, but there's going to be a much better website coming. And taxwallstreetparty@gmail, you can reach me, or 310-926-1584. So thank you, Webster.
Daniela, let me just mention in closing, I know Randy Credico is a good friend of Cornel West, that they've been in the trenches together. This week in Washington, we had the Million American March Against Fear, the one that started off as the Million Muslim March and was then attacked by Hannity and other media thugs.
By ghastly racists on bikes.
Absolutely. So just maybe you tell Randy that his friend Cornel West and I were sharing the same podium down on the mall. And
you guys really handled that in a very dignified way. I thought
we did the best we could.
You did the best you could. Okay.
Daniela, as you know, we have a standing order with you. We want to hear from you every week from now until November 5th and even beyond. And it's the Tax Wall Street Party, the idea whose time has come and that deserves the sincerest form of flattery, which is imitation. Imitate it where you are. You can imitate it the way Credico started as a Democratic primary candidate. Maybe some places you want to be a Tax Wall Street Republican.
And if you let them know, Webster, if they feel let down by Occupy because it didn't go anywhere and you feel disappointed, come over here because we've got a real program.
Right.
We're legal, and we are taking some seats in the House and in government.
And Tax Wall Street is way more radical than Occupy Wall Street and take over their park. Take their money. Don't take their park. And we'll be back in just a minute. Hopefully we get the report from the Middle East. See you soon. And remember the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the Russian fleet in New York Harbor, September 24th. And we will be having the commemoration and the celebration of that and of U.S.-Russian cooperation, which has worked well in the past to save the world a couple of times. Could work again if we could get rid of these Wall Street characters and these skull and bones degenerates like Bonesman, Blue Blood, Blasé, Kerry. So that's at the National Press Club, September 24th. National Press Club, September 24th at 7 p.m. Let me just get back to to Putin, two things that are, I think, worthy of stressing more. The Putin op-ed, we can say a lot about this. The most important part of it is not the American exceptionalism part. That is an interesting part, but that is it is not the heart of the matter. The main thing is stop using force and the language of force. Now, here's the key part. No one doubts that poison gas was used in Syria, but there is every reason to believe it was used not by the Syrian army, but by opposition forces to provoke intervention by their powerful foreign patrons who would be siding with the fundamentalists. Reports that militants are preparing another attack, this time against Israel, cannot be ignored. And Russia today has been doing a campaign all week. Watch out, any chemical attack against Israel coming from Syria, doesn't matter whether it's Assad areas, non-Assad areas, or any other area, that's a false flag. So now we've got the immense weight of a superpower, UN Permanent Security Council member, saying that there is such a thing as a false flag, and those Syrian rebels, they do it. Now, concerning the exceptionalism, what he's really talking about, of course, is arrogance. Right? People are sick of this arrogance. Now, I would say, you want to be exceptional? This is a practical question. The United States has been exceptional for the good and for ill at various times in the past. But if you want to be exceptional for the positive side, you got to go out and earn that. That has got to be earned every day. When you see somebody like Hannity or O'Reilly or these clowns, Limbaugh, they sit there and whine, I'm exceptional, I'm exceptional. How come you won't recognize how exceptional I am? I'm sorry. That's like a theory of self-esteem. Those reactionaries don't like theories of self-esteem, but that's really what they're pushing. They're radical subjectivists. It has to be earned. How could you earn it? Hey, you want to be exceptional? Perfect thermonuclear fusion power and solve the energy impasse of the world. Get yourself out of this carbon, no carbon debate, nuclear, no nuclear. Get into thermonuclear fusion power. Start a colony on the moon and or Mars. That's exceptional. Find a cure for cancer. That's exceptional. Here, I'll tell you one thing the U.S. has done. The Voyager space probe, launched in 1977, has passed the heliopause and has entered interstellar space, where the solar wind is less, the particles are more dense because it's cooler, and it is now more than 11.2 billion miles from Earth. That's Voyager 1. There's also Voyager 2, and it's headed for the Oort cloud of comets. There's an exceptional achievement. But, of course, there you're trading on something that was done back under the Carter administration. So it is alarming that military intervention in internal conflicts of foreign countries has become commonplace for the United States. And he also points out, if you keep doing this, says Putin, then you're going to convince the small countries that the only way to maintain independence and dignity is to have nuclear weapons. So you talk a good game of nuclear nonproliferation and WMD nonproliferation, but what you do actually causes it. The other thing I think I urge everybody, look at the Associated Press interview with Putin from about, 2 weeks ago now. Snowden. This is very interesting. Putin did not want to touch Snowden with a 10-foot pole. Snowden, and this is what he says, Snowden went to Hong Kong and got in touch with Russian diplomatic representatives. Putin was informed. I asked them, what did he want? He was fighting for human rights and the free flow of information. And I said, Putin said, so what? If he wants to stay in this country, he is welcome, provided, however, that he stops any kind of activities that could damage Russian-U.S. relations. This country is not an NGO. Russia is not an NGO. It has its own national interests, and it does not want to sever U.S.-Russian relations. This information was communicated to Snowden, and Snowden said, no, I am fighting for human rights, and I urge you to join me in this fight. And Putin replied, no, Russia will not join him. Let him fight alone. And he left just like that. Then he took a flight to Latin America, says Putin. Putin learned that Snowden was on the way 2 hours before his plane landed. Then the information was leaked. He says, no offense, but I think the CIA, U.S. Special Service agents, along with diplomats, should have acted with greater professionalism. They could have done something to put other countries under pressure, but they let him get to a country where he couldn't be protected and so forth. So now he says, now they want him. So he says, look, you want to have an extradition treaty? Sign one. The United States refuses to do it. The Russians would like to have Victor Bout, and they'd like to have some of the Chechens in particular. The one in particular that Zbigniew Brzezinski went to bat for. But no, the U.S. won't send Chechen terrorists back to Russia. So he says, we are defending specific norms governing state-to-state relations. And if you want to do something ad hoc, he says, let's do a trade. Trade us some people that we want, and we'll give you Snowden. No. Well, then he says, no, adds up to no. And there will not be any unilateral concessions forthcoming. So there we go. Now, I also point out with great, what can I say, disgust, Human Rights Watch. I'm sorry. The humanitarian interventionists, the Samantha Power gang, have gone too far. These are simply stenographers for the State Department, and we've got the report that they issued this week. This is a very bad example of the activists say school of journalism. Activists say, activists say, activists say. The whole report, although they hide it, is based on Skype and telephone interviews with supporters of the terrorist rebels, essentially cheerleaders for the death squads, and other stuff that they've gotten through these methods. But they do not respect any rules of evidence, and they're dishonest about where the stuff comes from. Now, they now claim that there was a massacre by the Syrian army in Banyas. Banyas is a place I know very well. I spent the whole day in Banyas in a seminar reconstructing how the rebellion started. And the rebellion started back in the spring of 2011, early spring. The rebellion in Banyas started when a group of logistics troops, draftees, garrison troops, were set upon with calls from the renegade imams of a renegade mosque, renegade mullahs. The call was to kill, and about 100 of the troops were killed, and they were operating under orders, don't shoot at civilians, meaning don't shoot at anybody. I'm waiting for a report from Human Rights Watch about those boys, the Alawite boys kidnapped in Latakia that showed up in the Death Squad film of Goutha. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're still trying our guest on the Syrian dossier in the Middle East, but it looks like the vicissitudes of the war zone are getting the best of us. But if we can, even a short interlude of one or two questions. The issue is these tapes, right? The State Department, the CIA, the White House have put forward a group of about a dozen videos, and the shocking thing that we found out is that some of the dead children, especially the young boys that appear in these films, are Alawite children, primarily, from the region of Latakia, over on the Mediterranean coast, who had been kidnapped 2 weeks before the great media offensive of the 21st of August. And you can imagine the horror of the mothers and fathers and relatives of these boys and other children kidnapped from Latakia, say around the 7th or 10th of August, and then after a time when they don't know where their child is, they get the horrible confirmation that the child is dead by seeing the face of the dead child in these films. This is the level of lying, right? This is the horror. This is Jessica Lynch. This is the Kuwait incubator babies. But this is beyond it because people were actually killed. These children were assassinated by the terrorist rebel death squads of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra in order to get a photo opportunity. This is basically what the Nazis did. This is Operation Canned Goods or Operation Himmler, where they took German convicts, dressed them in Polish uniforms, shot them full of holes with bullets, disposed the bodies around the Gleibitz radio station, and then used that to argue, oh, the Polish army took over the station, broadcast anti-German appeal. You get the picture. That's what started World War II. So now we've got the death squads, the Syrian rebels, trying to essentially start World War III using the same techniques. And we have people in country, in Syria and nearby, who are preparing the refutation of this. But of course, we have plenty of stuff, right? The amount of stuff. The Russian Foreign Ministry said immediately after the 21st of August that this reported chemical weapons gas attack was a pre-planned provocation by the rebels. That is what Putin then said in his press conference at the end of the G20 in St. Petersburg. Putin has now repeated that in the New York Times. It is a false flag. We've also got a 100-page Russian report. McClatchy News is on the trail of that, which points out that the alleged use of chemical weapons in Aleppo back in March was done by the rebels. We have Carla Del Ponte of the United Nations saying that based on her United Nations survey that the likelihood was that the rebels were using the gas. We've got this Dale, the AP stringer, let's see, Dale Gavlan, I think his name is. His story is, this is the Mint Press version, and Dale of the Associated Press says that these were chemical weapons introduced into the area by Saudi Arabia, by Saudi agents and operatives under the control of Prince Bandar, who emerges, I think, as the Himmler, the evil genius of this entire thing. We've also got a Kurdish video which shows how the impact site of one of these Grad missiles was doctored in order to make it look like it came from a completely different direction. So we've also got reports from the Syrian government covered by Russia Today in mid-July that 280-odd barrels of precursor chemicals had been captured by the Syrian army, which had been used, they were about to be used to prepare some kind of chemical weapons attack. We've also got, as Assad said in his interview with the degenerate Charlie Rose, Assad said you've also got that famous video of a rabbit being used as a guinea pig, in effect, lapin, in a test of the rebels of their own nerve gas, right, their own sarin, to see if it was working well. One a very important voice, well, a couple of them, right? Today is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Bishkek, Kyrgyzia, where we have, in particular, Iran speaking out that they said the world has to condemn and avert the use of force against Syria. And one voice of dignity that I would like to highlight, Dominique de Villepin. Now, this is a person of courage and morality, and he showed it by standing up to the thug Colin Powell, right? We're being asked all week, can you trust Russia? Can you trust Russia? Well, who's going to trust the United States after that performance 10 years ago by Colin Powell? So Dominique de Villepin was the guy who stood up to Colin Powell, right, in the Security Council. We don't believe it. It's no basis for the use of force. So Dominique de Villepin, coherent and I think principled, says no use of force. He praises the Russian role. He says, look at the use of force in Afghanistan, Iraq. In Iraq, we have 1,000 people killed per month in bombing. That doesn't seem to matter, right? Assad has killed all these people. How about in Iraq, where the U.S. destruction of the state and the destruction of law and order is now a civil war once again with 1,000 people killed, and Afghanistan similarly. And de Villepin optimistic, this can be avoided. And I would like to remind people, how come de Villepin didn't get to compete in the presidential elections? You want to ask a guy called Jacques Cheminade in Paris, working for LaRouche, who seemed to have done everything he could to get the mayors, the left Gaullist mayors, the progressive Gaullist mayors that could have signed for Villepin. Cheminade's minions and myrmidons were out there getting those signatures. So by the time de Villepin, foolishly, tried to gather those signatures, he could not get them. So we're told now that there are going to be talks between Kerry and Lavrov, or between the U.S. and Russia, at the United Nations General Assembly. This interesting thing, of course, right? September, time for the UN General Assembly, the 170, 185 countries of the world that are UN members. They get to come here. The foreign minister often comes, and there will be a round of speeches in the Great Hall of the General Assembly, including certainly Obama, I would think, and maybe Putin will come, right? I can remember when Castro and Khrushchev came and stayed at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem. So there might be the basis of an international festival of peace against war. In Geneva, notice it's Kerry, Lavrov, joined by Brahimi of Algeria, working for the United Nations, and Kofi Annan. I wonder what he's up to. But the point is that it's all ongoing. Now, I had hoped to get to a description here of the U.S. domestic situation, and it is, of course, that the fascisto Republicans are back, and they still want to shut down the government. There are between 50 and 80 libertarian madmen, Tea Party fanatics and lunatics, anarchists. They are anarchists. They're right-wing anarchists. That's not a good thing to be. They want to destroy government. They're against government in any form. They would like to use the fact that the country needs a new budget on October 1st to shut down the government, and they want to defund Obamacare. One of the worst things about this military adventure has been that it has paralyzed Obama's ability to get people signed up for Obamacare. At the point we're at now, the best outcome is that people sign up for Obamacare. And if you're sick, and if you think you're you're at death's door, don't die. Hang on. Sign up on October 1st, and you can get treatment on January 1st. And, of course, we want to avoid the bankruptcy of the United States, which is going to now come in about October to November, according to most counts. Use the 14th Amendment, pay the debt, roll back Cruz, Rand Paul, and the rest of them. And we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. And don't forget the Press Club on September 24th, 7 p.m., the Russian fleet, U.S.-Russian friendship, and we'll see you again here next time. To London, Paris, and Madrid, because all three were getting set to intervene on the side of the Confederacy and the slave power. And it also encouraged, therefore, the Union in the successful defense of national unity. And as Gideon Wells said on that occasion, God bless the Russians. Well, that's the National Press Club, Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. And you'll be coming out not just to get educated in the details of foreign policy and that period, which have been suppressed by the corrupt quackademic establishment, who have every interest in hiding these facts in line to try to make the State Department look good. But you'll also be contributing something to an expression of solidarity between the United States and Russia. You'll be paying a debt of honor, which is owed no matter what happens in the meantime, as Gideon Wells said. God bless the Russians. So I hope to see everybody that's in the D.C. area or who can make it any other way Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m., the McClendon Group at the National Press Club. And that will be a highly interesting evening. And we'll talk a little bit more about the program next time. Program's still a little bit in flux, but it will be a full program, and you'll be glad you came. So that's that. Now, there's also the great diplomat, the guy, the founder of modern diplomacy, really, in France back in the 1630s, 1640s, and so forth. Richelieu, his birthday was the 9th of September, and it was that Monday, the 9th of September, that marked what we're going to look back on as a diplomatic revolution. And very, very interesting to see Lavrov following in the footsteps of Cardinal Richelieu and of course, Putin. But the outcome of this now is that Russia has the avocation of saving the United States from itself. The Russian fleet coming to New York Harbor and San Francisco Harbor in September, October 1863, 150 years ago, in some very dark times of the American Civil War, after the draft riots, when the Confederate sympathizers ran wild in New York, lynching black people and killing black people in the streets. And when, of course, we also had the serious defeat of the Union at the Battle of Chickamauga on the 19th, 20th of September, a day that was saved, by the way, ironically, by General Turchin, a Don Cossack who commanded a division there, and he had experience in the Crimean War of the 1850s. He'd fought the British and the French in the Crimean War, and he brought that experience to the Army of the Cumberland, and was able to help save the day for the incompetent Rosecrans. It's a combination of George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and the Sledgehammer of Nashville. But Thomas and Turchin were the 1-2 punch for the Union at Chickamauga. In those dark times, the arrival of the Russian fleet meant everything. So we are now announcing that there will be a suitable commemoration with full historical details and in the spirit of Russian-U.S. cooperation, the combination that defeated fascism in World War II. That will be held at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of the McClendon Group, founded by Sarah McClendon, the dean of the White House Press Corps for quite a number of years under George Bush. She had served the longest. The courtesy of the McClendon Group has opened the possibility of having this commemoration at the National Press Club. The date, Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. The regulars of the McClendon Group may want to show up a little bit earlier, but you'll see that on the invitation. But for the vast public that will come, it'll be Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. That is the exact 150th anniversary of the arrival of the Russian fleet in New York Harbor, an event which sent consternation. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C., and we've had a week of rapid flux and ferment in the international sphere. We've also had a week in which the Randy Credico tax Wall Street Democratic campaign has scored an important success. We'll get the full vote totals later on in the show, but Randy Credico, running on a shoestring, has been able to surpass at least two candidates on the list, even though Credico was blacked out, boycotted, censored by the dominant Wall Street hyena power. Credico has surpassed Sal Albanese, and Sal Albanese had benefited from being in the New York One cable television and other candidates debates, where he was always included in the TV debates with such luminaries as Weiner, Quinn, and the infamous de Blasio. So we're going to be exposing de Blasio as a Soros clone, a Soros puppet. You want to go from the Wall Street protagonist, Bloomberg, to the left synthetic puppet of Soros? Well, if you want Soros in command and ultra-left destruction of civilization, ultra-left financiers, then de Blasio or de Blasio is your candidate. And we have reports of voting irregularities, vote fraud. Notice I say vote fraud, not voter fraud. It's not voter fraud done by little individuals. No. It's vote fraud done from the top down, and we normally say Karl Rove. But in this case, it looks like the corrupt New York City Democratic machine, the infamous Tammany Hall, that in a number of places in the Bronx, where Credico was especially strong, made sure that his name did not appear on the voting machines, on these old mechanical voting machines, right, where you pull the lever. You actually sort of kick the lever down, or you can vote the straight party line with a lever. Anyway, we'll get a report on that. We also want to direct everybody's attention now to the need to stand up for the U.S.-Russian relationship, which we have been doing here and which we intend to do more and more. As we've seen in this past week, President Putin of Russia, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and other people from the Russian Foreign Ministry, certainly, and other Russians in general, have done an important service to the world. Not only was this a masterful stroke of diplomacy, carried out, ironically enough, on the birthday of Cardinal Richelieu of France,